Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Sharon Koe. In today's episode, my guest in conversation is Sharon Koe. If you're thinking, her last name sounded familiar, well, that's because Sharon is my sister. Sharon studied education as an undergrad and cognitive science and education at a graduate level. She's now working her dream job as a Pilates instructor and a studio owner to carve safe learning spaces for all bodies. At the time of recording this podcast, I was beginning to venture into my own experience facilitating learning spaces. And so I wanted to have this conversation with Sharon to learn from her wisdom as well as her experience. She was also in the midst of what she called a Ramble Cure project, which is essentially a personal self-imposed project where she posted on her Instagram for every single day during 2021 in order to cure herself of her own, and this is her words, editor's hell. Knowing her practically throughout our lives and her relationship to social media, I thought that this was such a brave, ballsy move. Our conversation here revolved around radical acceptance, what that means, how it applies to working with others in learning spaces, and how Sharon is working with radical acceptance, specifically in her work, which has been impacted significantly by the lockdown. Finally, we also discussed how systemic silencing impacts us on a somatic level. This conversation was truly rich and very spiralic. It is full of metaphors, and I think that you will really enjoy the rapport because as I was recording this, it really kind of felt like Sharon and I were just having a phone call that we usually have on Tuesday night or whenever. So before we get into this episode, let me read you the bio that Sharon shared with the listeners of this podcast. Sharon is an educator, passionate sometimes to a fault to free minds and bodies out of fear and make aha moments a common experience. These days, she does that through Pilates and also through written and spoken words. If you let her talk, she will just keep going. She owes a lot of her aha moments through her forever teacher and guide, the host of this podcast, aka Jonathan. She's very sweet. All right, let's get into it. Here is my conversation with Sharon Koe. Hello, Sharon. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Well, for those who don't know, Sharon is my sister. So today you get a little bit of a peek into our siblinghood party, sibling party. And yeah, how are you today?
Doing good. Things are good. I'm so excited that you are doing this podcast. It feels like a long time coming.
Really?
Yeah, to me, it feels like, there's this part of me that feels like, why did you wait so long? But at the same time, like the time right now is always like the best time for whatever things to happen. But, it just felt to me like, finally, it's here.
Yeah.
So I'm glad. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for agreeing to be with me today. I like to start us off in the present moment because I feel like what we're going to be doing is We're going to weave the past, we're going to weave the present, we're going to weave the future into this conversation. So I like to just begin today, now, with a question of who do you feel, know, and sense yourself to be? And in particular, in this chapter in your story.
I am a leader, but I am also a follower. I open the paths for people, but I walk on paths that have been opened for me. I am also a manifester, and I am a person that needs a lot of rest. That's something that I'm getting intimate with lately, with this idea that I need a lot of rest in general.
Yeah. Wow, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I wonder how your relationship with the idea of producing things have shifted in the past couple years, let's say.
Really good question. I just had a reading with Kelsey.
Kelsey
you
Rose
referred,
yeah.
You referred Kelsey Rose Tort to me. And we were talking about that as a manifestor. Some would say that your work is 20% creating and then 80% rest. And that just like threw both of us like off the charts, because we were like, what? Right. And I think that the reason for it is that what we're trying to do, and again, like this is, and I like how Kelsey puts this. She said, see it as an experiment, like a way of you thinking about like thinking and like tinkering with the way you design your life, right? And what she was saying was that you're basically trying to put together something from 5D into 3D. So that's the reason why afterwards then you need to rest. And otherwise, like you would be burned out, right? So, and this is very, very much a relief to me. I actually have always attached a lot of my identity to like how productive I am.
Yeah.
It's something that changed after high school, I guess. You know, like once college hit, it was just like this like whole heavens and earth like opened up to me, and I felt like I really wanted to be more in the world. And so since then I've just like really worked hard to be more, to do more, to lead more, and just more, and always comparing myself against those around me. And I've always been with people around me who are very, very productive. I mean, when I see you, I feel like, you know, like with the way your schedules are, I always felt like, wow, he's really, really productive. So it wasn't really until when I found like human design that I started to realize like, oh, we are made for different roles in the world. And so how we manifest productivity needs to be different for everybody. You know this, but this year I committed to posting 365 rambles is what I call it. It's like a short, like 3 to 5 minute talk about just like things that come to mind for me. And it started as a way for me to heal my relationship with posting on social media. This is also related to your question about productivity. I didn't want to post for so long because I felt like whenever I posted, it would feel like all the eyes of the people are like looking at me. And so I didn't want that. But then, so this was a way for me to heal to that. But honestly, today is day 257 or 258. And I have thought about quitting 10 times in the past week.
Yeah, I feel like you're kind of in this 2/3 of the way juncture with that project, right? And it's very normal, very natural, I suppose, that's what is coming up, you know? And I honestly have just been like in awe that, first of all, that project, like just the generation of the idea of that project, is such a manifester thing. But the question is like, okay, if you have a whole team of people helping you with it, maybe that will not be so hard. But, as you were speaking, it's interesting because, of course, right, having your chart in front of us just kind of lights things up, and one thing I'm looking at is how you have um, Saturn in Aquarius, right? In the sixth house, Aquarius is often thought of as um, the rebel, or like, the one that brings the revolution, right? The one that is standing apart from the crowd and looking at what the crowd perhaps needs, or, playing that role of the seer. And Saturn often related to the need for us to cultivate discipline. I think it's just so interesting that your conversation with Kelsey came at a time when, you are entering this period, right? You're not yet at your exact Saturn return, but you're entering this period of Saturn return, and currently Jupiter is transiting over your Saturn. And so I feel like there's something there around, Jupiter magnifies things. So there's something around tapping more into that Aquarian energy, as part of what you are here to learn. And it's interesting that this word experiment came into the picture, right? And it is a bit of a topsy-turvy way of changing how you've been working and how you've been approaching things. And at the same time, perhaps it is a process of alchemy, of like you bringing in your pre-college version into this, and then your college version that is more like hustling, right? So your pre-college version is pretty relaxed. Your college version of you is pretty like driven, and then now you're trying to find where that balance is that really speaks to how to move forward, in a way that feels good to you.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough too, like you have your sun in the opposite sign of Leo, right? Where you have your Saturn in Aquarius, your sun is in Leo, which is opposite from Aquarius. And I just think that that's interesting. You brought up this idea of the ramble as practicing being seen, perhaps, practicing being visible. And it seems like it's all lighting up, and currently Saturn is opposite your sun. And so that's really interesting. There's this like disciplined structure, right, of posting every day.
Yeah.
And it has to do with like you being visible. And
I told you, right, that the ramble idea came after I sat down with you for a reading.
So interesting. What did I say in the reading?
I have no idea, but it was just like, we were actually talking about, okay, I remember now. We were actually talking about the South and North Node. And you were saying how like connecting, especially connecting to the Sagittarius part of me, which lies in the fourth house, right? Like sense of self and feeling like you're always here to like question status quo. And suddenly just came up like, I'm going to post every single day, and I'm gonna like record it in this like really like beaten down way, so that if people hate it, people will not see it. That's fine. We don't need you to see it, but it's just for me to be like, you know what, it's okay for me to post, and it doesn't have to be beautiful because this is real. Like I have pimples here, I have like, all kinds of things here, and it's okay. Like normalizing that you show up every day just like you show up to work, but it's on social media. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So how has that changed your relationship with social media, or has it changed your relationship with social media?
I realized that this was a way for me to be in the world. Does it make sense? In a
Yeah.
really weird way, because we are on Zoom all the time now. We don't see people, and I don't keep in touch with my friends every day, but instead we send memes, or we send like funny videos. And it's just like a really cool way that we've made it light, but also you're still connected. You wouldn't share it to like someone you haven't talked to in like 10 years, right? You would share it with like the top 5 people on your list. So in a sense, like we just transferred what we used to have on our phone or like our text messages. Now we just transfer it to Instagram. Also, I think in terms of like posting, I think I've just developed this newfound appreciation for people who do that for a living. It's really not easy, and it takes a whole team, and it takes it takes conscious thought. And I think what I was trying to get at is making things useful for people, because I was seeing that like people were posting things, and I felt in my many Virgo placements, just like, what is this? This is like unwholesome, so I try to like build a way that I could produce wholesome, fruitful, thoughtful reflections.
I feel that. I feel that really coming through. Yeah.
But they're really, really, and the thing is, like, sometimes there are like bad days when I would sit there and I would try to talk to myself for an hour and nothing would come out. And
really?
It's just like, ugh, yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Only to get like a stint of like 3 minutes. And it would take me like a full hour. Just like the words would not come, or like I would say something and like lost myself in the middle. And yeah, it's like, whoa, it's been a journey. And you realize that, you know what, exactly as you show up every day in the world, sometimes you're really messy. Here's what's changed about how I see posting on social media. I used to think that social media is shallow because you only post what you curate. But if you think about it, what I've seen is that I bled to find this curated version, and I still post it, but I remember for myself that I bled through this one. So it's not always about what you show to the world, but what you acknowledge to yourself is just as important. Does that make sense?
I'm kind of blown away by that observation. That's so, yeah, that really like opened my heart space. Like I felt my heart opening hearing that. And I can't help but bring it back to your chart and how you have Venus right on the midheaven, which is the highest point of the chart, or like what is at the top of the sky when you were born. And there's something, I think, metaphorically around you opening up to the world, to a public way of being seen, to the public square. And then not only are you offering that, Venusian bliss, right? Or like Venusian goodness, which, you have your Venus in Gemini, you're offering words and you're offering ideas and thoughts, right? And they're all in 3-minute forms, which is also very Gemini, right? And you're getting something out of it, You're getting something delicious for yourself as well out of it. Although it sounds like it's not without the bloodiness of Mars, which you have in your first house.
Absolutely.
And it's so Virgo too, It's like as you are pushing yourself towards that Gemini side of you, right? In the 10th house, it does bring out the story of still being a Virgo rising, and showing up as like this Virgo person in the world, because as you said, you were editing that 1 hour's worth of content into like a 3-minute summary,
Yeah.
So there's a sense that like in order to be Gemini, you have to be Virgo. Like your pathway to Gemini is the Virgo, Yeah.
And in fact, that is exactly what you said at like at the end of last year, before I embark on the journey, because you were saying that essentially for you to become more comfortable with the two nodes, is to bring the Virgo into Gemini, and then the Gemini into Pisces, and the Pisces into like Sagittarius, like something like that.
Yeah.
You may not remember, but like that's like essentially like merging those squares. Yeah. And I felt like somehow as we are reviewing that 9-10 months later, you realize that, oh, I took your advice. I heeded it too hard.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm interested in this little strand that you kind of brought into the conversation around how social media and texting and all these ways that we communicate with each other is kind of like the vehicle, right? And that to me, the vehicle of communication brings me to Mercury, and I'm looking at your Mercury in Cancer, right? Which is often thought of as like the nurturer, And so one thing that we've been talking about prior to this conversation is the idea of radical acceptance. And perhaps, the exact wording wasn't in our original conversation, but I'm thinking of how radical acceptance is connected to belonging, and how belonging is connected to learning. You are trained in education, and our education system has largely been kind of in a communal setting, right? And so thinking of the idea of radical acceptance, belonging, learning, community, right? All of this seems to me like your Mercury in Cancer, kind of like saying, hello,
that's actually
talk
a
to
really
me.
good point.
Talk to me, right? Yeah. And in the 11th house too of community. So I'm really curious to hear how you would define the idea as well as the praxis of radical acceptance at this point in your life.
I think of radical acceptance as this idea that whatever comes at you, if you lean back and surrender and throw yourself back, you would land on like a soft beanie bag. And not this beanie bag that like will never help you get up again, but it's just like, this sense of like safety. Not trampoline, because I think trampoline, like you would like bounce back up, right? This is not the happy feeling. But I see radical acceptance as like, no matter what comes your way, no matter what happens, if you fall, it's not necessarily like someone catches you, but it's just this feeling that it's okay. I still got this. So there is smell of resilience. There is smell of intimacy with yourself, because sometimes it may not always be possible to have someone by you as you are falling down, right? But you got to be like, okay, it's fine. I can get back up. So it makes me think, as I'm talking here, like about the idea of failing in the classroom as well, right? Like, are we allowing kids to fail and say to themselves, it's okay, I got this, and then like they stand up, they brush themselves off and run again. So I think that's the feeling that I get. But to maybe like bring the point down, like how I've been thinking about radical acceptance is this idea that you have experienced a situation, like a very concrete situation, where whatever you say, whatever you do, and especially after the mistakes that you've done, because we all make mistakes, you look back or you look around you, and it's not that the people are just like smiling and saying it's okay necessarily, but they're there. They're still there, and they're like, yeah, okay. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
And the idea for me originated from a conversation with a friend I was talking to this friend that sometimes, unless you've had this experience, you may not find it in religious commitment. So we were talking about how, like, um, having security in your like faith commitment, right? And I was saying that you can't necessarily say that and like say that it works for everybody, because sometimes if let's say you've been bullied, you've been rejected, you've been neglected for a long time in your life, for any period or season in your life, when you are trying to get back into the swing of things, you're scared, you're hurt, and you're like, can I trust this? Will this thing accept me? Will this institution be okay for me? Right? And I think that feeling, like, unless you have had this experience where, like, I hope the community will be there as well, like, like we got you here, then only then I think you can understand all the other small instances of radical acceptance. Am I making sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I hear that there are two sides to it. One is the part about developing that resilience within yourself, like
Mhm.
radically accepting yourself, and then also seeing that acceptance mirrored in the outside world by the community that is around you. Yeah. What do you think is the relationship between the two? Do you think there's any relationship between someone being able to offer themselves that radical acceptance versus being shown that radical acceptance by their community?
Really good question. I think, and this is like purely by observation, I think that you need to be shown. You need to experience it first, but then that gives you like a foot in the door, and then you have to work within. Because I don't think the community will ever be fully complete to give you like all that you need.
Yeah.
And in fact, you will then start to leech on them if you don't work on yourself too, right?
Yeah.
If you keep asking for radical acceptance from this community, but never really use that good energy, that radical love, to help you want to heal from the inside out, then you will never be able to function fully in the community as well. And we're not talking about how like everything needs to be practical and pragmatic, and so everybody needs to like this is like a give and take. Not really, but then there's dysfunction in the community. As long as you're there and you're taking the radical acceptance, but you're also not using that to heal yourself, so that you can, without even thinking, already be emanating radical acceptance to other people, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's almost like, I think, if I understand what you're saying, it's this idea that not only do you take radical acceptance from people around you, but you need to start embodying
yeah,
that force, right? You
yeah,
need to start
yeah.
embodying that way of being. So I'm curious to hear if you have noticed any impact of radical acceptance or lack thereof in your work as a teacher, as a facilitator, and also just within your immediate community. Like, how have you seen radical acceptance or the lack of radical acceptance play out?
I think that so many people have not tasted what it feels like to be radically accepted. I will say that for myself, I have had an experience, and it wasn't until there was a relationship crisis that I had, and I like messed up big time. And um, when I woke up from that like burst from that explosion, I saw that although everybody around me was hurting, they radically accepted and said, it's fine. And I think from then on, that was actually the path for me to go in to myself and to ask myself. It came a little bit in guilt, but then like afterwards, it just became like, like I felt this. I felt this so personally. Now, how do I become that? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So I think that unfortunately, when I've seen like clients that come to me week by week by week, complaining of the same pain problems, or sometimes they tell some stories about their relationships, and I see again and again, like somehow, somewhere along the way, and somewhere right now, right here, they are not feeling that acceptance, and they were hoping that the many relationships that they go through will give them some sort of that acceptance, right? But it's almost like they're trying to like collect pennies, hoping that one day it will amount to like this one thing. It's also hard for me to tell them like, look, this is not self-love, right? or like how do I say that? And in fact, then I feel like sometimes like we're in a tight spot where we're like, I want to tell you sternly because I am telling you like this is radical acceptance, but they've worked all their lives collecting pennies of tokens of acceptance. It's not easy to receive that, because as I was saying in my story, of like experiencing the radical acceptance, like for me, it was so extreme. I had to see my whole life and future blow up in front of me before I could see that, and yet I could stand up again.
So it's a trust fall of some sort.
Yeah. Yes. And the trust fall is just, the thing about the trust fall is that you will leave everything behind. You will build anew. And that is what I think sometimes people don't feel ready for, ever, for radical acceptance. So they settle for dust. They settle for distractions. They settle for collecting pennies, tokens of acceptance, rather than the real thing.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to ask you was why you think we often prefer this state of like collective stagnancy. Like there's a sense of like just being in this collective comfort space that is stagnant over allowing ourselves to taste the dynamic and like transformative power of radical acceptance. But maybe before we even get there, I'm curious to hear more if you have more thoughts around why we stop ourselves from radical acceptance. Like, what is the primary barrier?
Really good question again.
In yourself and in the people that you've worked with. Yeah.
It's very cliche. It's fear of the unknown. Then you will scramble with whatever you've tasted before, right? It's like, let's say you exist in this space where there is no such thing as the taste of sweetness. And then I come in, bringing you a jar of honey, and you're like, wait, what? No, I can't imagine it. I've only tasted bitter, salty, and sour.
Yeah.
So I will not ever get there, right? There's this feeling of like, well, what if I can't feel it? What if I don't see it? What if everyone else sees it and I don't? I think that's also like a big fear right there. This feeling that what if my experience is not something that is shared with the people around me?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then maybe also
Alienation, basically.
yes. Um, yeah. It could also be that you don't trust that you're so severed from listening to yourself. So when your voice comes and you're like, this taste is sweet, like you can't hear it. You can't hear it. You just shut it down. You're like, no, this is not it. I've only tasted bitter, salty, and sour, and I'm going to stick to this.
Mm.
So I think it comes from a place of harsh. I don't know. Like it's very harsh, right? It's but weirdly enough, that is exactly the way some organizations work. Some organizations, right? And then like maybe the way some nations organize their people. So yeah. So why would we say that it's easy for people to experience the radical acceptance, because it's never been there. Like my professor, his name is Michael Hanjit Hansen. He always says like teachers teach the way they have been taught. So if they've always been taught to memorize and to like holler, then of course they will do that to their students. Of course, there's like agency, there's things to change, right? But also understand, I think that when we need to acknowledge that as well, that you are sort of your past.
Yeah. What I was hearing was that there's something you said there around conformity, and I think maybe even like control. I would say that control is probably the more sinister take on it, but there is a sense that it's not just from the perspective of the authority, right? Like you need to give your power away thinking that external belonging or some semblance of belonging is more important than your own sense of belonging to yourself. And I think often when we talk about radical acceptance or about acceptance in general, we often create the dichotomy between the two, right? As if they're separate. But as I'm speaking with you here, I'm sensing that they're not separate. And when you have to give away your own acceptance of yourself, or when you have to give away your belonging to yourself in order to belong externally within that community, then like a part of you is always going to be lost and going to be disengaged and dissociated from the experience of true belonging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes it may not come true. Sometimes it may be that actually the community can still, so to speak, like fit you in. But before you are there, you will not know. And so that's why I think people stop themselves from going there. Because what if I don't have that, right? Then maybe I would sacrifice my pursuit of this truth or this belonging to myself so that I could just attach myself to belonging to what I have here.
Yeah. And it is, as we have been talking, right? It is a trust fall. Like it's a sense of like either the community is going to fully take me in and embrace me, or I'm going to be completely shut out, right? And that polar opposites those two options can be too scary sometimes. So as we are inching towards, actually, I wanted to ask you if there's something else you wanted to say there.
Oh, I was actually going to ask if that experience, like, so feel free to like cut this out if you want. But like one of the reasons why the idea radical acceptance came to me as well is that I saw the way that your life has unfolded. As a sibling, I've always had the front seat, right?
Yeah.
And
for better, for worse.
For better. So what I saw was that you coming across astrology at first, and then later on with tarot, with intuitive work, intuitive healing, and like everything in this realm, is a way for you to find language and for you to kind of discover that feeling, to me, when I've observed it, as radical acceptance. And I think not only, but through this experience and you getting deeper and deeper into the community, I think that you can heal some of your wounds maybe in other aspects of yours. But for me, what lit up was maybe even your relationship to your faith. Because so much of our faith tradition teaches us that you have been safe. You are radically safe. It's a once and for all. But sometimes the way that we describe it in an organization like a church is that, but don't do that. But don't do that. The but is much, 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 much louder than the radical grace, the radical acceptance, the radical salvation, right? And I feel like it wasn't until this experience lit up and like became a life of its own for you, that you could heal some of that relationship. What do you think about that? How do you feel?
Thank you for that beautiful reflection and for turning the tables on me.
Because that's what we do.
Astrology helped me understand that acceptance has to do with honoring some sort of original design. Rather than thinking that there is this universal, right, applies to all human design, it is in honoring the specificity. And then, for me, tarot actually helps with seeing the world through the lens of archetypes. Because tarot to me is very much like it's a moving art. It's if astrology takes you back to the beginning, right, or natal astrology takes you back to the beginning, to me tarot brings you into the present moment, because you ask at this moment and you get a certain information, and then in 5 minutes you ask, the information might be changing, and recognizing that there is always that push and pull, right, between the root and the wind blowing the leaves, right, is really powerful. And I think energy kind of ties it all together, And so I think that, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think with regards to radical acceptance, right, the part that maybe I'm still working through is this idea of institution and this idea of what happens in an organization, right? Because I think it has a lot to do with dogma. Like once we prioritize dogma over humans, I think we tell people within organizations, perhaps without this exact phrasing, but that they are dispensable, that they are replaceable. The dogma is saying you fit into this or we're going to toss you, right?
Yeah.
And into what role, if any, you feel like radical acceptance is a prerequisite or perhaps an essential component to learning, or is it more a byproduct of learning? Especially, because I know that you studied education, and I feel like there's a way in which in your life you have been part of different institutions. And you're kind of working within these institutions, even though now you're not really a traditional educator. Although you do play that part too. You do play some of the roles of traditional educator. But I'm curious how acceptance of the self and being accepted by those around you play a role in learning.
I think that radical acceptance is the way that we create safety in the classroom. And I don't think anyone can learn anything unless they feel safe. I don't think it's a prerequisite because I don't think you arrive. It's a practice. It's one that you come back to again and again. And I think that probably more than once in a day, probably more than once in an hour. Every single time a child stands up and says something bad or something really nasty to another child, what are you going to do about that? But what are the other kids going to say if someone stands up and talks to you as a teacher in a nasty way? Well, because they're also agents. Let's not forget the fact that they are just as much an agent as the teacher is, right? And so how can we build so that they know that you are the adult in the room, but then also everybody is responsible for each other in that sense, for creating that radical acceptance thing. And I think also I see it as a practice because just as you were saying about spirit, about energy, like it changes. I think in a group of people, it needs to change as it comes. With the shifting priorities and with all that. Then if I see it in like my daily teaching in a private setting,
meaning as you're teaching adults
in Pilates. In Pilates, when I'm teaching adults, maybe the sense of, I think it's the same, right? It's the same. You are not the only one creating that culture or creating that environment or creating that energetic field of radical acceptance. Your client is too. And they may not realize it.
So there's like a reciprocity to that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So it's a shared work. And again, it keeps changing. It's like dance. Sometimes there are moments when the gap is like smaller and there are times when the gap is bigger, right? And either way, I think that yeah.
I think it does. I'm also curious to hear if you have weaved this idea of radical acceptance into your work. And perhaps, in ways that you've always done, right? And now you're only becoming more aware of, or in ways that are new to you, that after you invite in this idea of radical acceptance into your work, that you've noticed you've noticed the shift in the way that you've been carrying out your work.
We can start with the classroom because my background is in elementary education, and then I ran away from it as far as I could. And I kept coming back to it for some reason. And although I am not in the classroom every single day with the students, maybe what I've seen change is that I am not the only one responsible for this class, right? My students are just as responsible as I am. And that is something that now I work with teachers who are trying to enact that in the classroom. But boy, is that hard, right? And you see now, especially with Zoom, how that dynamic has like basically been obliterated, right? It used to be that the teacher is standing in front of you, and if you were like fiddling with your pen, he or she could just come over, pick up the pen, and be like, "See me after class," right? But what are you gonna do now? The other day, I was observing his class, and then a kid was called, and he didn't respond, and he responded 5 minutes later, and he said, "I'm sorry, miss, I was just like taking care of my dog. This is class time. How could you be taking care of your dog?" Right? But this is what the world has become in school, because school has been put in the house now, right? And so I think that so going back to what I was saying, I'm like going in like all kinds of directions, but what I'm seeing there is that there's that reciprocity, as we were saying, right? And so this radical acceptance, like the teacher needs to feel like they are being accepted as well. How can you do the trust fall if you know that all the students will step back and like let you fall to the floor, right? But I see it all the time, and I think that is the reason why teachers are burnt out. Teachers are scared to take new risks, and teachers feel like they are doomed either way. They can't leave this profession, but even if we go back to school in a physical way, it will never be the same. So this is the breeding ground for change. And yet change is, it's a lot more complicated than we think. Now, if we talk about my own practice in like teaching my clients in Pilates, I think I've always tried to establish the sense that I am here to hold space. I am here not to absorb their emotions, but I am here to be here. So if they say things, it passes. If it says things like, like not passing meaning like I don't listen to them, but I'm not letting it eat up at me.
I'm
not letting it
that
define
get stuck.
me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I am there. And I think in the sense, I hope that this is the way that I communicate radical acceptance. Because the last thing that I want in my practice is a teacher standing beside me on the reformer thinking, why is she like this? Can't she be better? Why hasn't she figured out this thing about her knees and her feet? It's pretty simple, right? But it's not. If it's simple, then we would not have come back to you. So I try to make it a space where people feel like no matter what shape and size they come, I am here to bust all the myths that you have about Pilates should be this way and it should be done this way. I am here to work with your body, and I'm going to talk to your body, and your body will feel like they have been radically accepted. If not by yourself first, but I can extend it because I feel that through Pilates, I have accepted my body more fully. Not completely. It's the journey, like you were saying, but at the same time, I think like I have enough reservoir to share some of that with my clients who are maybe still on that journey. But that is how I see radical acceptance in learning. And I find that even little things like saying to them, it's okay if you miss the bar. It's okay if you jump and then when you come back in and then the equipment bangs, right? because in Pilates it's like you can't bang the machine, but if you bang and I say it's okay, they actually it's really powerful. You see the body just go like, thank you.
Yeah.
And they won't do it again because because it's rather than us feeling irritated and then suddenly the client does that again and again. Yeah. And I think that's like when that space is shared, the energy is shared. And so what you give out, and this is especially toxic if you don't even realize what you're giving out to your clients, then it's kind of difficult to see how like the acceptance kind of like unravels, and you have to like build again. But of course sometimes it unravels and you have to build again.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that there's a way in which you've been deepening into each person's body's intelligence, and then not just putting the responsibility on you as a teacher to teach this person, but that the body knows its own intelligence and that you are working with that person's body's intelligence. Yeah. That's really interesting because I think, as someone who is not in the fitness industry, I don't even know if you would call yourself part of that, but I would think that like Pilates is somewhere in that fitness industry, right? What I've noticed is that in the past few years, there has been a lot of shift in the conversation around whether certain moves are supposed to, whether bodies are supposed to contort to be able to do certain moves, or if the moves are supposed to be adjusted or work together with the body, Yeah. And I think that that's an interesting progression in this industry. I mean, I hate that word industry, but like in that community, let's just say.
Also, Pilates is sadly a little late in this conversation, but conversations about race, representation, history, lineage, it's just something that I think maybe the yoga community has talked about. It's not without problems, but they talk about it. But here, like in Pilates, like they're just beginning to. But thanks to other practitioners in like surrounding communities, I think we've been really like catapulted to talk about these things, right? As for what you were saying, like like things like the melt method, Suhitsman, right? But like everybody else in that community that talks about fascia and makes it their whole life's work, the knowledge that they gain from all this like experiential learning helps them inform how we teach people into their bodies.
I'm curious to hear if there's anything else you were wanting to talk about that we haven't talked about.
I do have one point that I am really thinking about and I'm struggling with in my own journey right now. And struggling meaning that I am wrestling through it, right? Is this idea of silencing, of systemic or personal silencing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where this takes place, but whenever there's silencing, this is what we are doing to divorce people from being able to taste radical acceptance. And what I said about the kids, like, would the kids stand up for the teacher if one kid was nasty to the teacher? I also wonder in my own position, in the different positions that I have, like in Pilates, I am the leader. So I call out when that happens. But and it's still a small community. So, as it gets bigger, I think I will have to go through some journey with that. But in another organization where I am part of a school, I see that happening again and again. And yet it's almost like it's been designed, the system has been designed, the group, the community has been designed to silence, to not call out what's not true, to call out what's not right. And again, I think like if we are truly in the pursuit of radical acceptance, then that has to start from wherever we are, right? It's not some nice concept that we think about and then we store it in a book and we put it in a bookshelf. Like, how will this change the very fabric of the way we relate to one another? And so I think that, it's just something that I am wanting to call out. And I know that we don't have a lot of time to talk about that. And I'm hoping maybe at some point you can cover this in one of your episodes, because this is about language as well, right? Yeah. What is the language of silence, right? And I think like what's lighting up for me is when people are silenced again and again and again, then they learn to divorce themselves from radical acceptance. Because they divorce themselves from themselves.
They divorce themselves from their own agency to think and to voice out what it is that they are thinking about. I think, this is kind of a huge conversation, right? This is a huge topic because silence is a tool for control too. Like silencing people is really a tool for control. And I think by taking away people's agency, maybe even without realizing it, I think it's what I've seen in my own experience, right, with a lot of spaces is that it's not coming necessarily from bad intention. It's not coming from like an evil, this kind of like, I'm going to control you, right? Like dictatorial kind of perspective. But I think it is, it's a tough balance too, because I think it has to do with like hierarchy, which actually hierarchy is natural. Like if you look at nature, right? Yeah. There are hierarchies, but I think what is perhaps not in alignment with where we want humanity to be heading towards is the idea that the control mechanism, the power structure inherent in that hierarchy, right? Because hierarchy, when we think of it in terms of process, it's important because otherwise we will not have any level of efficiency whatsoever, but going back to your point about silence, I do think a lot of it is somatic. Like I think so much of it is like held in the body. Like when I think about my own work, which I've done a lot of deep work around silencing myself, around my throat area, it feels like a lot of energy kind of stuck around the clavicle, as well as kind of around the heart space. It's because when we shut ourselves out from our heart space, and this can show up, I know I'm just kind of being very general about it, but I think it can show up in so many different ways. But it is a body memory.
Yeah.
Because at that point of speaking up versus silencing yourself, it's a moment of choice, right? But your body almost like shuts down, and retracts back into silence as being safer. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that point up.
To add to that, a lot of people are dysfunctional around their pelvis area, because the pelvis, right behind the pelvis, is psoas, right? And the psoas is where you hold your most deeply held emotional trauma. You hold it everywhere as well, in fascia, everywhere. But in the psoas, like when you release that part, when you allow the psoas to be in that like open optimal space again, it's very common that people respond in tears, in, it's just like this like outburst of emotion, because that's where like all of the trauma is held. And I think that people are coming more and more to me. My business has risen in the past 5 years because people are becoming so distanced, divorced from themselves. And I think it shows up, yes, in the chest, but also in the pelvis. So it's like the body is just like coming into this curl.
Yeah. So as we draw to a close here, the name of this project is Future Language. And I'm curious to hear from you how you see us evolving our language around radical acceptance, around learning, around institutions, and conversely, how do you see radical acceptance evolving the way that we use language, and maybe even our perception of our nature?
Maybe I'll start with the second question first. I think that when we have this feeling that I have not arrived, but I am always at home, I think it changes everything, right? Maybe for me, there would be less anxiety for traveling and this need to like create comfort wherever I am because I feel so unsafe, maybe. In learning, I think it will change so much the way that kids or just students or participants download information. I hope they don't download information. I hope they are willing to engage. Most people are not willing to engage. Most people are programmed to stop engaging because it's too hard, because it hurts, because I will be shut out, right? And so I think this concept of radical acceptance will change the way that I hope students can perceive learning. Okay, so then in terms of the first question, the first question is
the first question is really, what power does language have in building perhaps a more radically accepting world?
Well, I think language is so powerful. I was just blown away by this. It's actually like a really old research by Vygotsky. He said that kids play. Why do kids play? To learn language. In fact, they learn language through play, right? But also the other way around too. Like they use language to play, and then it just goes like back and forth, right? But the more that they play, the more they are eventually able to internalize what they have in their minds, right? So instead of always using your hands and the external like the material world, you can also internalize that, and that is where language comes in. And so I think that the way that we think, the way that we observe, the way that we interact with the world is always never divorced from language. And so I think that maybe having this in our vocabulary will help us evolve in the way that we communicate with one another.
Yeah. I really like that idea of play that you just brought into the picture here because I mean this has been a pretty serious conversation. But 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 there is like a certain level of playfulness that we can engage in with language, right? That we often forget as adults because we've been conditioned to be very serious, be professional, to speak a certain way, to hold ourselves to a certain standard when we're communicating. But I do think that there is something kind of trickstery, even around like this idea, right, of like acceptance. That there's something that I think you opened me to in the beginning of this conversation of how acceptance is a two-way street, that it's not just like the teacher accepts the students, right? But the students also kind of needing to be in a space where they can express their acceptance towards the teacher. Like, what does that even look like? And we haven't even like explored that, I think, fully in this society that we live in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really exciting, and I am so grateful that I got to have this conversation with you, and I am so honored that you said yes. I'm sure we'll have you again.
I'm
This
so
is the
glad.
first of many conversations we'll have in this podcast.
This is just taken out of like all of the phone calls that we've had. Imagine if we had like recorded all those phone calls.
Yeah, I think it's different though. I do think that
Yeah.
there's a heightened quality, right, to like knowing that somehow we're pressing
Yeah.
record. So
Yeah.
it is a little
Yeah.
different. But I do feel like I learned a lot from you and from the different angles that you shared within this conversation. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here with me today, and I hope that you found something helpful, insightful, and nourishing from our conversation. As always, you can find all the ways to connect with Sharon on social media, to book Pilates sessions with her if you live in Jakarta. And Sharon also shared 2 Instagram handles. One will lead to her personal account, where you can find the Ramble Cure project, which we discussed in this episode. And then the other will lead you to the account of Brave Spine Pilates, where she's using her words to free bodies of fear. I really love that languaging. I really encourage you to check out both, as Sharon really has some beautiful, powerful, heart-led thoughts to share throughout both of her accounts. If you found this podcast or this conversation inspiring, nourishing, or helpful to you in some ways, I would really, really, really love it if you could subscribe, rate, or review this podcast with 5 stars or whatever is the highest ranking on your podcast app. If you think that someone else will benefit from this episode, please share them too, whether that's on social media, with a friend, or with your community. I really look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself, and I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening.